This is CounterPoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. In this episode of CounterPoint, I want to focus on a debate that has been steadily building within Alberta itself, one that raises fundamental questions about the province's future, its relationship with the rest of Canada, and what it means to feel heard in a federation. Why is this conversation around independence right now gaining renewed attention? Why now? Is it primarily driven by political frustration, economic concerns, or a deeper sense of regional identity that has never really fully been resolved? And when Albertans talk about separation, are they expressing a serious constitutional aspiration? Or are they trying to send a signal that something in the current system is not working for them? Across the province, opinions are sharply divided. Some see independence as a necessary step towards greater autonomy and control over local decision-making. Others warn it would come with serious economic and legal consequences that cannot be ignored. And in between, there are those still trying to understand whether this debate reflects a temporary surge in sentiment or a more lasting shift in political thinking. Well, on today's show, we'll explore those perspectives directly and ask what this growing debate says about where Alberta is headed next. And to have that discussion, I'm joined by journalist Elie Cantin-Nantel, who produced and directed a documentary on Alberta separation titled Inside Alberta's Growing Independence Movement. Elie, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, so what spawned this documentary? I mean, you're not originally from Alberta. Why make a documentary on Alberta separation?
Sure. So, yes, I'm not from Alberta, but I'm from Quebec, which is the other province with a long history of separation. And I come from a family of Quebec independentists. Basically, everybody in my extended family voted yes in the two referendums. So, I'm very familiar with the frustrations that Quebecers have with Ottawa. And when I was in finishing up high school and was 18, I had an opportunity to go work in Alberta. I was a campaign manager for a nomination, and I worked for an MP, and then I worked during the 2021 federal election. And I remember very, very clearly the amount of people that said, if the East keeps electing the Liberals, we want out. I remember 5 years ago seeing that there was frustration, and I thought back then it was at a breaking point, and now it's at a breaking point because, well, since then, there was Justin Trudeau's last term, which was the most destructive in my view, and that was followed by Mark Carney being elected, even though had the election just taken place 2-3 months before, Pierre Poilievre would have won in a landslide. So to me, I saw all of this context, and I'm like, there's something going on here, especially given that the same media that said that Trump would never win, that Brexit would never happen, are now saying independence is never going to happen. I think there's a lot more to the story, and something that I thought was worth flying out to Calgary and later Edmonton to see what was going on.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those sentiments that are feeding this growing movement. You mentioned the legacy of Justin Trudeau, and I recall probably the first real surge in the independence movement happened under his father, Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. So I don't know what it is about the Trudeaus, but it definitely fans some flames of separatism within Alberta. What specifically, at least in our memory with the recent Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, what specifically did he do? What kind of policies happened that really drew the ire of Albertans?
Well, I think a big one is everything related to energy, right? So the Liberal Party, in their first convention after they won the election in 2015, this was a 2016 convention, they had Stephen Guilbeault as one of the big speakers. And Stephen Guilbeault laid out a pretty radical environmentalist vision. And the Liberal Party went on to adopt much of that vision, including by bringing Stephen Guilbeault into cabinet. This was the government that passed Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Bill C-48 to buy in tankers that wanted to put all these regulations in. Justin Trudeau himself once said the oil sands needed to be phased out. And that caused a lot of problems in Alberta, a lot of investment uncertainty,
Mm.
job losses. And the stat that sticks out the most is the cancellation of $670 billion of natural resources project. So after 10 years of this in Alberta, where this is like the main industry, the economic driver, people have just had enough.
Yeah, because I don't recall hearing this under Prime Minister Stephen Harper's tenure. So, these, I could see how those would feel, would make Albertans feel very frustrated. Anyhow, we're going to continue this discussion in just a moment. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing Alberta separatism and whether that movement really has legs. And joining me is Elie Cantin-Nantel, a journalist who produced a documentary recently about the Alberta separatist movement. Elie, again, thank you for being here. And it's an interesting perspective you provide because, as you said in our first segment, you're not originally from Alberta. You've lived there, but you're actually Quebecois. So you have perhaps in a similar yet also different perspective. So I appreciate your lens on this. When we talk about Alberta frustration, especially economic, especially as it ties to energy policy and development, and you listed a couple of the major pieces of legislation that has really kind of put handcuffs on that energy sector. How much of an impact does a piece of legislation like C69 have on a typical Albertan? How many Albertans are really tied to the energy industry in that province?
There's a significant number of Albertans that work in the energy industry because the energy industry is quite big. So it's not just like the oil rig people. You have a lot of engineers, you have white collar people, lawyers, executives, right? So it's a very, very large industry. Um, as for bills like C69 or even the industrial carbon tax, I was just speaking with some oil executives this weekend, and they say that the industrial carbon tax itself creates investment skepticism because they're like, well, if this is in place, it's going to be more expensive. So what happens is when you have a government, like in the case of Justin Trudeau, who literally says he wants to phase out the Alberta oil sand, the third largest or fourth largest oil reserve in the world, when you have a government that then goes and appoints a climate extremist as its environmental minister, Stephen Guilbeault, a guy that literally climbed the CN Tower, when you have these bills, C69, C48, the adoption of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, which many in the sector had said too would create some uncertainty.
Hmm.
Well, are you really going to invest billions of dollars into a project that could potentially run into roadblocks down the road? Probably not. So the bills, what they do is when you add all of this together, it creates a disaster for investment. And that's why you have the catastrophe of $670 billion of canceled projects.
So, besides energy and economic concerns, are there any other issues that are feeding the growing sentiment that Alberta may want out?
So it is primarily economic, and this is something that differs from Quebec separatism because Quebec separatism had a very strong cultural element to it. You
Hmm.
had a lot of artists, like this was a lot of artists in that time were separatists. There was kind of a pop culture element to the separatist movement. The whole idea is we want kind of a French nation, whereas here it is mostly economic. That said, there are a few recent issues that have I guess, joined the movement. For example, the frustration with immigration under the federal Liberals, where they opened the floodgates to record amounts of immigration. Some people in Alberta think, oh, well, if we're independent, we'll be able to reduce our immigration numbers. Jeff Rath, who's one of the lawyers for the separatists who I interviewed, told me, for example, that they view immigration as immigration and deportation. So
Oh,
there's kind of
wow.
that element there. And also just I'm sure there's some people in Alberta. They look at the U.S., they look at the red state type culture where everyone's conservative, and they kind of imagine if we had our conservative nation, maybe things would be a bit better. That said, the main frustration is economic. It's the Canadian dollar that's worth a lot less than it used to be. It's the cancellation of projects, the growing debt, the taxes that are extremely punitive all across Canada. That seems to be the major point of frustration. And that's also what the separatists are campaigning on. I mean, one of the things they are promising is no federal income tax, and that's very appealing to a lot of people.
So your documentary highlights that this pent up frustration has really materialized into this petition drive to get a referendum question on whether Alberta should separate. Talk to me about this petition and the signatures.
Sure. So in Alberta, anyone can trigger a referendum if they pay a fee and they collect the number required of signatures, which is around 177,000. That is based on a calculation on the number of people who voted in the last election. And the separatists or the independence activists did meet that number. They say they have over 300,000 signatures that have been collected. So for a couple of months, you had petition signing locations across Alberta. You found them on the sides of roads, usually someone with a pickup truck and some Alberta flags. And if you're an Alberta resident and you had a piece of ID, you could sign this petition. And this can be done for a lot of different initiatives. There was another citizens initiative, and it was to try to get Alberta to stay in Canada, for example. You could do one on, all sorts of different policies. So it's very democratic in the sense that it's the people that get to decide to have a referendum. And it does take away the onus on Danielle Smith. She doesn't have the pressure to declare one. The people can do that themselves.
Okay, I'm going to pause you there. We're going to pick up this discussion right when we come back from the commercial break. Welcome back to CounterPoint. We are discussing Alberta separatism, and joining me for that discussion is journalist and filmmaker Elie Cantin-Nantel. Elie, we were discussing this democratic process that's really grassroots of garnering signatures to trigger a referendum. I think you said there were about 300,000 garnered so far, and the objective is to get on a ballot the question as to whether Alberta should remain or secede from Canada. Is that correct?
Right. Yes. They want it to be basically, do you want Alberta to cease being a province of Canada?
Wow. So this process, again, it's democratically, it's a democratic process. It's being followed according to the law. Now, I do recognize that I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the now Premier Danielle Smith, she tweaked a few provisions within that law that some argue may made it too easy to get these signatures or to get this question on the ballot. Can you explain that to me?
Yes, yes, for sure. So Danielle Smith, she did put in place several changes to the Citizen Initiative Act. So this act was introduced back when Jason Kenney was premier, and the idea was let's have some greater accountability. Let's make democracy more of the people, by the people, for the people, so to have recall and then the citizens initiative. But the bar was very, very high. You needed a very, very high amount of signatures. And the big frustration really came around with the Recall Gondek campaign. So Calgary had a really horrible and unpopular mayor called Jody Gondek. And at a point, people had enough and they wanted to recall her. And the threshold was so high that even with a very, very strong campaign, they still weren't able to reach that momentum. So at that time, Danielle Smith had said that she would look into changing and tweaking the law. And in the days after Carney was reelected, she announced some of these changes. They mostly were about extending the amount of time people had to collect signatures. They were reducing the threshold, the number of signatures needed to trigger a referendum. And then she later put in another change, and that was because prior, the chief electoral officer was able to ask courts their opinions on a proposal, and she removed that ability as well. So there was quite a few changes, and yeah, the critics say that those changes have made it easier for the separatists to get what they want.
But for the record, I don't believe Danielle Smith is pro-separatist. Is that correct?
No. So I interviewed Danielle Smith back in September, and I posed her this question. I said, look, being from Quebec, I really think having the two referendums really helped our province get a lot of what it wants strategically. Mm-hmm. I personally am not a Quebec separatist, but I do think the referendums have been strategically helpful. So I asked her, don't you think having a referendum and Ottawa seeing that this is a possibility, do you think you could get kind of what you wanted? And she told me no. And these were her words. She told me, I see my role as making sure we don't need to have that vote. So Danielle Smith was not only not in favor of separatism, but she actually didn't even want the referendum to take place. She believed that she could get along better with Carney. So
right.
That's just something to keep in mind as detractors call her a separatist.
Yeah, no, that's why I found your documentary interesting, because it really showed and demonstrated that. So where does the petition sit now? They got the requisite signatures, so what happens now?
So there's a few legal hurdles. Now, by the time we're recording this on May 12th, so maybe by the time this airs, the situation will have changed. But as of now, there's some Indigenous peoples that have put a legal challenge, and they claim that the petition violates their treaty rights, and they had managed to get an injunction from a judge saying that the electoral officer couldn't certify any petition for the time being. That said, Danielle Smith has also said that any petition that meets the number of signatures will be put on the ballot. So there's still, a couple things to negotiate. But the people I speak to in Alberta, including my sources at the CBC, are quite confident that there's going to be a referendum this fall.
Okay, and if the referendum says yes, we want to separate, what does that mean?
Okay, so that's a good question. In Canada, we have something called the Clarity Act. So after the last Quebec referendum, the federal government asked the Supreme Court if a province could secede from Canada, and the province said that it couldn't be done unilaterally; it had to be done collaboratively. So there has to be a clear question, so not a vague question. There has to be a clear majority, and then there has to be a negotiation process with Ottawa and that province. So if the yes vote were to win, if the percentage was deemed to be clear majority, if the question was deemed to be clear, then Ottawa would have to begin negotiations. I don't think that would happen overnight. We could be looking at years of negotiations, kind of like Brexit. I've spoken to people who say that this could take decades, but yeah, that's what we're looking at. If the yes vote were to happen, it would be an absolute reckoning for Canada, to be honest.
Okay, we're going to be right back in a moment. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on Alberta separatism, and we're taking notes from a recently produced documentary by Elie Cantin-Nantel, who's a journalist who's lived in Alberta but is actually from Quebec. And we're discussing what his research has shown in this documentary. So actually, before I forget, if people want to view your documentary, Elie, where can they watch it?
Yes, it's on my YouTube channel. So you can just type in my name, Elie Cantin-Nantel, ELIECANTINNANTEL, or look up the title Inside Alberta's Growing Independence Movement, and you'll find my documentary there.
Okay. So what were some of the surprising things or that you researched or that you uncovered while you're making this documentary? Like, I think for a lot of people, they don't realize how much momentum there is under the young generation for Alberta separatism. Why that cohort? What other things surprised you?
So the thing that's most striking, or maybe even concerning, is how just widespread and mainstream it is, even in circles of people that you wouldn't expect. I've been at fancy cocktail parties where I have people that are dressed head to toe in designer clothes that are former business executives that will whisper into my ear, "I'm a separatist." I'll be voting yes. I call them the closet separatists because they won't say so publicly, but they're separatists. Something else that I noticed, and this is where I think it can be a bit of cause for concern, is I met and spoke with people who said, "I'm not a separatist, but I will be voting yes because I want to send Ottawa a message." Okay,
Ooh.
let's look at some polls. There are some polls that show that support for independence is around 41 or 42%. If those polls are correct, and let's say you have 10% more people who say they're going to be voting yes to send Ottawa a message, you could be looking at a 51 or 52% yes. And so that's part of why I'm making this documentary. Like, I think this is a much bigger story than what Mark Carney and the media are currently saying it is. This is the biggest story in Canada right now. And if Alberta were to leave Canada, if we were to lose that oil, that province, that economic driver, the rest of Canada would be screwed. And that's to put it lightly. So yeah, that's something that surprised me. It's just, this is not a fringe position or movement anymore.
Right. No, I've followed and tracked this story, and I can see not only is it growing momentum, but as you shared, there are a lot of closet separatists that you would not think there would exist. So when you say some people are voting or they would vote yes to separation if this was put to a referendum, what is the message they want to send to Mark Carney? What do they want him to hear?
They basically want to send a message to Ottawa that they're sick of being taken advantage of. Alberta sends a lot of money through equalization to other parts of the country, including Ontario now, by the way. And Alberta feels that they're not getting the respect they deserve in return. I mean, you had, for example, Justin Trudeau leave out Alberta of his Canada Day speech one year and named every single other province. You have federal politicians attacking Danielle Smith for her policies. Have policies at the federal level that disproportionately hurt Alberta, like the carbon tax, like the Bill C69, C48, the environmental regulations. So Alberta just feels fed up. They feel taken advantage of. They feel like the rest of Canada wants their money, but does not want them to prosper. So that's kind of the main frustration and kind of main message I heard from people.
What about the federal conservative leader Pierre Poilievre? He's originally from Alberta, but represented an
Mhm.
Ontario riding for many, many years. Now is back as an MP in Alberta. How does this referendum and the momentum for its call help or hinder his chances at electoral success?
So when I was in Edmonton, I spoke with Loan Gunter, who's a veteran journalist and columnist in Alberta, and he said there's real risks for Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre, and this risk, by the way, also extends to Danielle Smith because they're both going to have to come out and say they are federalist, and they'll be expected to campaign for federalism much more than Carney or the Liberals, because the media is going to be like, if you don't say anything all the time, you're a separatist, right? We live
Right.
in this ecosystem. A big portion of the conservative base, the UCP base in Alberta today, supports independence. So, there are some risks there. They will have to navigate it well. I just think they cannot be dismissive of it, and they just have to listen to people and take their concerns seriously.
Okay, Elie, thank you again for making this documentary and for joining me on today's show to discuss it. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to suggest a topic for the show, feel free to reach out via X at Granic Allen or via the News Forum website. This has been Counterpoint. Thanks for watching.